Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you here. It's great to have a few minutes to talk about what we love to do, which is to draw and paint and sculpt and print make and all sorts of creative things. And let's get started. I think it's going to be a really nice experience. Again, I thank you for not only being here today, but also being a part of the larger conversation. You give me a chance to do what I love to do, get involved in a lot of research and a lot of sharing and all sorts of things related to this Patreon account. So we have a pretty special thing going here, and it means a great deal to me to have you here. And again, I thank you. I'll run through some of the things that are coming up regarding educational opportunities because that's why we're all here. And after that, we'll look at some sketchbook drawings and do some Q&A, and you can ask me a few things. You could either chat them or you could unmute yourself and ask them straight away, and I'm happy to address anything. We know first and foremost that drawing and painting technique and the ways that we engage technically are every bit as profound a series of ideas as the concepts which overlay them in terms of what you're going to do with your work. And that's one of the things that makes such a difference for me, is to get into the profundity of this dialogue that we have, because there's so much to talk about there. People have said, well, it's really the ideas that are the most important thing, and the technique is nothing. And I feel quite the contrary, that the technique has become something extremely important to me. It's very philosophical when you look into some of these texts and you almost literally read between the lines of some of the old books. I have tried to quote a few of them now and again because they dig deeply into things that interface with materiality and give us opportunities again to study and to learn a great deal about our craft. I know we have some folks here from all sorts of places all over the planet. We've got foreign countries such as California, just kidding, as far and wide as Australia, so welcome again. And let's get into some of my screen sharing. Let's talk about some events first. I've got a class that really was inspired by discourse and conversations with folks through the mentorship. What I want to do is create a summer class. The class is going to be called In the Footsteps of Manfred Meyer, Fundamentals of Constructive Drawing. Fundamentals is a broad word, but it's really something that relates to the constructive awareness, how you build a drawing, how you teach yourself how to see through form and see through a drawing. And that's what we're going to talk about. I really have been a fan of this person named Manfred Meyer. Some of you know who he is. I've even talked to you about his work and his writing as recently as last week during the mentorship meetings. This is the foundation program at the Basel School of Design in Basel, Switzerland, circa the 1970s. And Manfred Meyer really was a leader in this environment. What he did is he organized a curriculum which was published in the 1970s, in 1977 to be exact, and it was recorded in this series of books called Basic Principles of Design. This could be the first reason for showing up today. This book here is volume 1 of Basic Principles of Design. There are 5 volumes in total. It's difficult to acquire these days because it's just kind of expensive and all of that. However, you don't have to spring for all 5 volumes. It's really, truly volume 1 that's the main book that I'm going to be referencing in this particular course. The course is going to involve itself primarily in the constructive principles, and there's something about the way that Meyer was going about this practice, which was progressive, which built from simple to more complicated, that just really appeals to me. I'll show you some of his drawings from this era. These are hand-drawn ellipses. These are hand-drawn forms and structures. And you can see from my cursor that they have some of the evidence of arc and arc in perspective. And these things are vital for those of us who are working from photography, from source imagery, from various things where we have to use our imagination. The construction side is the missing link in so many of the critiques that I engage in. And so I've always gone to Meyer not only because of this type of work, but also in other circumstances where he's teaching people how to draw brooms and brushes and things that have a very slight bit of taper. If you recall the things that I was referring to in the Vanderpool lecture on the planes of the head, there is a vestige of taper in the planes of the head hidden inside this brush throughout. And these, again, being hand-drawn depictions, are very interesting because what they do is they allow an artist to begin to think about the spatial organization of their forms and their thought process. Not only that, but we've got the ghost lines, as we sometimes refer to them, the ghost lines of the armature, which are surrounding the material, encapsulating it like you would see in a building that's surrounded by the construction. Like you're getting a renovation, you get a scaffolding around the building. This is the linear scaffolding around the form in this particular vise. He's doing this with all sorts of things that are partially organic and also partially what we call architectonic. And these are again images from that book from the 1970s, Volume 1, where he's going after piping that you would identify in faucets or plumbing or different tubular constructions, which I have to tell you, I see all the time. And we are always talking about when we're referring to something in the body which needs work or needs attention, it has to do with the visualization capacity. That's what we call it, visualizing the body and the framework within so that we can get to the exterior and do all sorts of other things like orchestrate light and shadow or commit it to memory or pursue other means with this undergirding what we do. And so I can't recommend it highly enough, and I would like to follow his progression in a loose framework at the very least. This one is one of my favorites. He does a train. Now it's a toy train. This is ostensibly the end of the train over here on the right. Do you see that? I've always loved that. I just think that's a great drawing. And so what I've decided to do is to teach the locomotive from the outset. So I'm going to be doing the locomotive as the first lesson, lesson 1 of the month of June. This course is going to take place during the month of June. It'll be probably 3 sessions per month. I'll shift the focus from the locomotive to something else which is related to Manfred Meyer as well as to our own pursuits in July. And I will continue to build on this course for about 9 months. I am not requiring anybody to do this. I'm just saying that based on a lot of conversations and our organic dialogue, that this would be a highly necessary thing for us to get into because it just feels like a deficit from the discussions we're having. It's available through Advanced Mentorship, and if you want to sign up for it, there'll be limited spots available. It'll be a live class on Fridays. I'll put a post up about it later today on Patreon so you can get more information, because I know it's hard to take all this stuff in real time, and you can think about it. But if you want in, then you just have to elevate your membership to Advanced Mentorship, which is part of the mentorship options on Patreon before July 1st. Getting back to this is the train, and you can see how he built up the train with these boxes and constructive forms and through here. Really beautiful stuff. These are photos from the 1970s. And these are, again, hand-drawn ellipses to try to x-ray the forms, as we say. And that is the gist of that. The plus side is that you'd receive the recordings in perpetuity, and so you could refer to those. Part of that is a really important aspect of the study, because the studies, especially digitally, they happen so fast. A lot of the learning is condensed, and I want there to be something there for posterity. It'll be listed up there for you, and you can check it out. I'm such a big believer in drawing and the capacity of drawing to lift an artist out of a series of misconceptions. And I think we're all on the same page about this because we believe in the power of this enterprise to uplift your creative spirit. There's so much that goes on in my classes, especially the in-person ones, that harken back to the interface of geometry and anatomy, especially when somebody's trying to understand the inner construction of a human thigh or a head or a hand. It's all aspects of geometric interpretation that make the biggest difference of all. I think it is the veritable key to the anatomical framework. I am reminded of a situation that I observed when I was teaching dissection drawing in Philadelphia a number of years ago, and I was in the hallway and there was a medical student, and he was leaning up against a wall. He was just racking his brain trying to think about which nerve innervates which form. I just knew this was memorization and it wasn't visualization. Visualization is something completely different. If you can visualize the spatial locations of your elements, you don't really have to memorize them. They're in there. They're churning and they're giving you all sorts of ways of sort of waking up at 3 in the morning and coming up with alternate geometry. I will move on to the second of the announcements that I wanted to cover for you today because of additional questions that came through from the Menzel workshop, from the Zygomatic workshop, various master classes and such, it was suggested that we cover fetching. And so I'm going to get into the idea of copying fetching. If you remember and think back with me for a minute, the context of studying fetching previously was the calligraphic line. There were, I think, some legitimate critiques of the drawing that I was doing in the figure sense, in the portrait sense, from the constructive standpoint. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to file that away, because certainly we were talking about the capacity of a line to feel fluid, expressive, lyrical, beautiful. And that was the mainstay of our approach to fetching in the Hatchmark series, because to me, and you can let me know what you think, everybody, but I think that Fetching's work really fits in perfectly with the calligraphic line, and the way the calligraphic line blows your mind. It really makes you think about music, among other things. You probably agree with me, because we all look at Fetching with a certain palpable sense of awe. Nevertheless, we didn't get a chance to go into the construction on his forms. And so when we look at this drawing here, which is part of the in process that I was dealing with in that tutorial, there's a bunch of uncovered aspects of cheekbone structure. There are various iterations of the alar cartilage, is what we call this region. There are aspects of the jaw construction that we could get into in a Fetching workshop that will deal with, again, ways of reinterpreting the forms from a creative standpoint, so that you can walk away from that workshop and be thinking not only about the way all this stuff flows together, but that there isn't too much flow. Because we've all seen drawings that have too much lyricism, they kind of turn into just dripping water, dripping paint, and there isn't any solidity to the form sense. And that is the reason for doing the workshop. I want to talk about an additional alternate figure study that he has, as well as I have 2 portrait studies in mind, 2 drawings that Fetching created that I'd like to look into. In particular, there's one that we got into a heated debate about in an online class some years back that relates to a certain way of rotating the structures. There's another portrait drawing that has an incredible rhythm to it that can lead us into some ideas about how to build the mouth, for example. Those are burning images in the back of my mind, in my memory, that I want to clear the air on and get into with you in a group setting. So if you want to sign up for the Fetching workshop, please feel free. It'll be this month in May, and we'll talk a good bit more about the constructive underpinnings of his work, potentially, as well as the line and lyricism of his execution. All right, let me check the chat while I'm here, just before we move on. All right, thank you for asking about, can this method of drawing help us to improve our anatomy drawing? I assume that you're talking about the constructive form. And yes, indeed, it can help you. If you picture any anatomical form that you have in mind, anything, it could be a muscle in the thigh again, it could be your calf muscle. The way that we think about the calf muscles, just to name something offhand, is to imagine teardrops. Teardrops have structure. If you were to make a teardrop out of cake icing, you'd have to build a cone, and you'd have to build something that looks like a sphere or a bubble of some kind. And it's because of that that I have thought of constructive forms and structural drawing as a delivery system of anatomy. So we have, on the one hand, anatomy as a concept, but then on the other hand, we have structural drawing, which goes together with anatomy. And so this idea of doing a class in structural drawing is actually kind of a class in anatomy, as I see it. Thank you for your question. It's going to take some time for all of us to go through the material and then to revisit the material, just like we do in all of the great books. There are things that you don't pick up on the first time and the second time. And I do this myself. I go back into the tutorials that I create, my own tutorials, so that I make sure I'm pulling information from lesson to lesson and from tutorial to tutorial, because I'm creating a dialogue with you just as you're building on this kind of silent internal dialogue with yourself as you go back and reread books you've read before or other sorts of things. I think in many respects the schools that we've previously or heretofore occupied are going away, and more our education is going to be in settings just like this one. I think this is probably the most important space to interact And that's why the tutorials are something of an obsession for me in terms of taking care of the post-production the way I do. So I appreciate your positive response on that. It's definitely important. You sent in some marvelous things, some very inspiring things, but also the fact that we're in a group setting together means that we can talk a little bit about each other's imagery and share some ideas. And therefore, as I go through some of this material and look at some of the images and maybe do some annotation, I would encourage you to maybe unmute, ask a question, because I won't necessarily be that good at checking the chat from here on out, but I'll try. All right, so in no particular order, I pulled together, 10 or so images that we could look at, because what we're talking about in sketchbooks is maintaining something quite important. We want our sketchbooks to be part of our lives. It's like a mirror. It reflects your daily activity. It's something that is completely your own. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's not purposed to ever go in an exhibition. Nobody's necessarily going to buy it from you. It's something of a visual diary, and therefore you take it everywhere you go. And if you break out a sketchbook when you're in a waiting room or something and you just draw in pen and ink for 2 seconds and it turns into nothing, so what? You engaged visually, creatively, and it continues to stoke that part of your brain and your spirit which needs this, because we all need this in a way that we're still trying to understand. All right, so I'd encourage you to continue those sketchbooks, and that's really the reason for today's discussion, which we can't always have every month. And so my student Jack sent in the drawing that you're seeing here. He is an instructor, as many of you are. It's great to have you here as well. And he teaches high school students in a very elite, creative high school. What I thought I could do on this, Jack, is to take the image and couple it with the image here, which is a lot easier to see as I included this image. So the first idea about the position of the body has to do with the tutorial on the center of gravity, or the line of equilibrium, which is going to come up again in a fetching copy that was sent to me just before today's discussion and meeting. What this means is it's kind of like a fulcrum point. As you're looking at the body, pitch outward, really push its weight and its presence in a certain direction over here. What you're seeing over on the other side is a counterweight. What we will tend to be doing as we look at drawing, painting, sculpture, is we think about a heaviness down here, and the farther something goes out this way, it's often counterbalanced by something going on out in that direction. And what's interesting for me about this, Jack, is I don't see this form here, which to me has a lot to do with the legitimacy of the weight distribution, because I don't think that this form is heavy enough. And I think that if you add something over here, to me it visually looks a lot heavier immediately. And so I would encourage you to look at that as an additional element, because it's kind of like a tree. If you study the way a tree trunk lifts up in a particular configuration, you've got the tree branch over here, you've got the tree branch over here, and I believe it's these two elements here and here that really add so much of the believability factor for what's going on. What Jack is doing is he's steering the forms in certain directions. So by having that navel right there and allowing there to be just a slight amount of reposition so that it's going that way, he's giving us some rotation. And that's really important in these master drawings, because what they love to do is they love to rotate a lot more this way, and then they like to reverse that. Because if you look down at the knee on this form in the original as well as in Jack's, which is very accurate for the position question, what they're doing is they're showing you more of this side, and then they're reversing that. Do you see what I'm talking about? Then they're showing you more of that side. That is a classic convention in this kind of drawing, and artists love that. We've always gone for that. And you can see that the hatch mark we're creating in through here, which is beautifully light, almost like a 2H, 3H. It has a certain precision to it and a clarity, and so it cuts. The hatch mark cuts in these two different directions. When you go in these two directions, everybody, what you're able to do is to create an even value, because we're not always just going the same way to create an even value. Sometimes we really want to cut in and go in multitudes of directions. We don't want to go in too many because it can create chaos. If you start going in 6, 7, 8 directions, it can start looking a little bit messy, and we're not after that. But a few directions are elegant, and that's what we're getting in the treatment here. It's interesting because if I go back and look at what he's doing, he's got that direction, and he's got this direction, and he's got that direction, and I think that's kind of perfect. I would simply advise continuing some of this. And what I mean by that is if I've got this direction going this way, why couldn't I carry some of that direction up in here? You have done a little bit of that here, but there's a bridge that I think is missing some of that tonality. I see what I'm referring to happening beautifully in through here, and you've got some of the perspective being laid out in through here. That's a beautiful thing because it creates a top. That is the top right there. And what's cool about the treatment in your drawing is you're also showing the bottom because you're reversing the hatch mark. I'm going to show everybody what that means. We are going in this red direction one way, and then we're going that direction the other way. And then you flip it in the wrist. So you go this way, and then you go that way. That creates a spatial dynamic in a drawing. If we embrace that, then we can masquerade form and space in 2 dimensions using pencil in this case. If Jack were to go in and make a lot of this super dark, then he's committed to it. He's all in. But because he's open-minded, his mark making is really light and considerate. And I think that harkens back in some ways to the original, because I don't see a lot of darks in the original either. It's really quite beautiful in the way this is depicted. So this came in from Elena. I juxtaposed yours with Leonardo da Vinci. Whenever I put my work next to Leonardo da Vinci, I always feel bad. But the reason why I did it is because you sent me a position of a head. It looks like it's a little more studied than a sketchbook drawing, but I accepted it anyway because I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about the head in space for everyone who's joining us today from different parts of the world. There's one thing that I think should be clarified, and that is the position of the Leonardo da Vinci. So I reversed that and put it over here. And even the activity of reversing a Leonardo is interesting, isn't it? I want to go back and look at that one more time in the original form. Isn't that interesting? If you've done that before with Botticelli, it's also fascinating because when you flip an image, you just get a different sense of things. There was a question about that in the context of a mirror. I think someone was asking me about clarification on the use of a mirror. And this, in some sense, is what we're talking about. Things can be very severely different when you put a mirror up and you look at your image. And if they're that different on Leonardo da Vinci, believe me, they're going to be that different and sometimes arresting or off-putting. We'll see these situations arise in our own work. When we're looking at the Leonardo, and I think what we can learn is right off the bat, there's a sense of awareness in the Da Vinci drawing of the top of the head. If I trace out the top of the head, I'm thinking about a boat that is tipped over, a capsized boat, like a vessel. Because if I draw the lines of the boat down and around, there's something about the way that that is filling out. You're close to that in your drawing, but I think you've got to go in with a little more dedication in through here and really think a lot more about the position of the head in space. Because if you don't do that, if I cut those lines away, what you're going to wind up creating, probably inadvertently, is a cranium that looks in a different direction. You always want to make sure that there's a unity of placement to say that this is unified in its direction just as much as something right here. And it's a good test for yourself if you're ever being thrown off or something like that, and you take a step back, you cover up the face and ask yourself, does the cranium look in the same direction as the face? If it doesn't, then it's a pretty simple fix. All you have to do is rethink the midline to get the midline to go in there and place itself a bit differently. If your person that you're drawing has a bit of a calic, or they have an unusual hair partition, it could be a slightly more complicated thing. But I do think that would help. The second thing that comes to mind in this is the control of the tone, which has been a part of the discussion The idea of making sure that the tones and values are succinct is built around the shadow. And so if we think about our shadow tonality, notice, all of us, we should see this, that there is a very close or tight range in the shadows. It's almost as though this is barely touched. It is touched a little bit, but it doesn't come nearly as far into a light as this does. And I think this is giving you some trouble. Because if I go in there, you see that is beginning to compete with the lights. This tone and this tone here are giving each other some trouble. Take a good look at that, because your tones are adequately anchored. They're nice and dark, and they're also dark in sepia world. As you go forward, you should start mixing together some of your sanguine. Sanguine is this more orangey substance in through here, and some of your sepia. If you don't do that, then they'll wind up looking too disparate, as we say. You'll have a warm area, you'll have kind of a cooler area, and they won't quite feel like a single image. And I think we can all appreciate how epic this is, this piece on the right, because of all the mixtures of mark making, so exquisite, and the mixtures in some sense of temperature that are evident in that piece. There's one more thing to touch upon, which is edge work. And we see, of course, he's the master of sfumato, Leonardo. But you see just how precise the lines between darks and lights are configured in here, and how not everything is sharp. Look at all that stuff. He's just so classic on working through the eye socket. And I think in the case of the drawing here, I think there's too much crispness throughout, and therefore some of your poetry is lost. And if you could make things a little bit less sharp in certain places, then the things that are sharp are going to look a lot more appealing to your viewer. Those are my thoughts. So the second part of your question, what you have to do is make friends with somebody who has no eyebrows. And what you do is you go to lunch with that person as often as you can. I had a friend like that who teaches at the Art Students League. Looks just like a World War I soldier. In fact, I don't think that he has no eyebrows. He has one eyebrow hair on each side, and the rest of it is just this amazing coagulated form. That's the only way to describe it. It's like painting clouds or something. In the same way that my eyebrows, which are way too large and monstrous, his are just really taut skin that moves and shakes according to facial expressions. And I think Leonardo just had a natural affinity for that part of the face and part of the head, and loved to see the form over and above all things. And I think in some sense, it's kind of a good lesson for painting and drawing people with tattoos, because the lesson in tattoos is to remember, for example, on the shoulder, that the better you get the deltoid, the stronger the tattoo is going to come through, because you identify the governing form that sits underneath the tattoo. You are very welcome. And speaking of you, you're the next one on the list. I selected a couple of your images here because I thought the ones that you had on either side were more poignant to the conversation. I really love the figures, the facial expression that you're getting in these. I love the twisted mouth. And I wanted to say that as you're laying in your sketchbook work, because you have to work so rapidly in real time, it's not like a long pose where you have 20 minutes to work and then you've got another hour to figure things out proportionately, or 2 hours to build up the tonality. You got to go in and get it done. And lots of times you use hair as a medium to get yourself into that spot, into that place. And so I think that going after the hair and looking at its directionality is really one of your key things. What I would suggest in this area, however, is that you try to make the hair that's sitting on the mandible and the hair that's surrounding the head have a little bit more flair and flow. Think Laocoon, the great sculpture, and how things are churning around that Laocoon head. And see if you can get the hairline to encapsulate and surround your figure. I think this one is also really beautiful because it has a feel of an individual. And when you can get that in a minute or even 30 seconds, there's something quite nice about that too, isn't there? Because so often you get into a portrait and you search it out and you go into the subtleties, talk about Leonardo and no eyebrows and all that, and you try to get into the spirit of acquiring a likeness. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. But when you can do it in a sketchbook in a few seconds, there's something in that where you equip your arsenal of creativity with the capacity to make something happen almost in no time, literally. And so that appealed to me as well. And I thought this was great also because of the idea of working outdoors and working with a broad mark. It seems to me you've got some stumping going on. You've also got some areas in through here that are much more tonal. And you're juxtaposing the lines and the tones and thinking about the sweeping quality in a lot of this material because, first of all, you're doing landscape. And so I want to address that. We are both big fans of John H. Vanderpool. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen the John H. Vanderpool landscapes. A lot of you haven't seen those before, but this is an example of a John H. Vanderpool landscape drawing. And this is a person who is a master of the figure. So it's very interesting to see the choices that would be made from a person who made their living, their bones, their legacy out of drawing and painting the figure. And you can bet that so many of the principles which enable the teaching are evident in the decisions that have been made about the shapes, about the underside. Think of this like a big umbrella dropping down and comprised of a huge underplane. And maybe imagine Vanderpool doing the same thing to this tree as he might do to the pelvis or the gluteus maximus of the model in pose. Think of the lean of this angle and through here and how that is contrasted by some of this. These are like, in a way, people. And I'm reminded of the John F. Carlson book, the landscape painting book, where he says, trees always make way for each other. They appear to dance together, which has really always been a fascinating thing that he said. Nature doesn't necessarily crowd nature. And I think Vanderpool is not only aware of that, but also is putting together something really inspiring out of a seemingly random scene. This is also really great. Just a beautiful handling. It's also a lesson about archival materials because he was drawing on this illustration board, which is clearly not archival. And this will be something that you want to be mindful of as you go forward, all of you, because as you get better and better, you want to preserve the works of your hands, as Ruskin calls them, for your descendants, for people who want to look at your creations and value them and covet them and trade them and collect them and all the rest of it. We're going to have some trouble here with this Vanderpool given the acidity of the material, but it's gorgeous all the same, isn't it? Really spectacular. And so I wanted to go here because you had some great questions about the handling of the graphite, and these are clearly graphite. I've seen them in person, and I can tell that he was using, we think about a sharp point on a graphite pencil. He's not really using that here. It's the kind of point that you would go in and temper and mess with because you want to get the right point on the pencil. This is a very important aspect of drawing in a sketchbook, is to customize your tip on your pencil so you can get marks that feel like this and feel like that. Otherwise, they're just not going to give you the variety and the splendor of nature. You're not going to be able to capture the wind through the tree as he's able to in this particular example, which is such an admirable thing. And so when you go back to your image, now it's probably springtime, so there isn't much in the way of leaves that you're going to go after here, but I could see you doing more benefit to your sketchbook work by playing with different tips in your pencils, okay? And then in terms of your questions that you sent along with the imagery, you say how to round out a puffy jacket, how to distribute graphite in big masses quickly and evenly. A lot of that is going to be in the tip, by the way. In terms of the twisting, overlaps are so important, but you don't want to do too much of an uninterrupted line. You want the line to be interrupted by additional overlaps. Therefore, you might have done better to keep this a little bit light on the handling so you could go in and do that absolutely, which signals that it's traveling away in space. But then you put this via a different overlap in front of that and in front of the trunk, and that creates a spiral. It's really the beginning of translating that Manfred Meyer concept of the corkscrew into the tree. I pulled a couple of images here. The puffiness of the jacket is going to be something that is definitely linked in to modifying the way that you twist your wrist as you draw. So I'm twisting and laying the pencil down more flatly as things are going in this direction. I'm lifting and just sliding across with a very light touch here. It's all the same pencil, because there isn't any time. You get 15 minutes tops to do a drawing like this, and then you're done. That's the way it is. That's the way it works. But it's so great because in a certain regard, there are lots of exercises that we all do that relate to the beginning of drawing, and they're healthy. They're really good for strategic thinking. There aren't that many exercises that we could all identify as tied into finishing, are there? You know, a lot of the finishing exercises are things that you'd be identifying at the end of a very long drawing. You might say, well, I've done this drawing, I put 40 hours into it. Let me start to go into some hyperlinear edge work, or let me think about the light direction on the form, and that's how I'm going to finish the thing, or I'm going to look at the edges, that kind of thing. But the idea of going into a finish, of going into a finishing drawing and looking at the sketch that way is a totally different way of working, because you're jumping to the finish. You're going right to the end of the line, right to the end of the drawing. And so I could recommend that because that's part of a holistic way of teaching yourself how to draw. Same thing here. The puffiness of the jacket, I mean, we get a lot of winter coats here, so we have different climate. These are just by way of sharing and talking about that tip factor, you know, making the tip really blunt in certain cases, so you can again practice the finish, practice the carving of the edge or the rim, and treat the sketchbook like a brainstorming tool. It's an idea generation forum. That's all it is. And if it doesn't work, guess what? You just forget about it. Abort mission, tear it out, throw it away, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's not precious. It's terrific because it's not precious. And then you suddenly realize when you loosen up that you start making some really great ones that are well worth preserving. So it's a counterintuitive thing in some ways. I'm a big fan of puffy jackets, what can I say? But I also like the idiosyncrasies of sketchbooking. Like when you see somebody who falls asleep and they suddenly, it's like their whole face kind of collapses, and you draw that, and then you look back at the sketchbook 6 months later and you remember that thing about how their face just kind of fell down. Or if somebody, I don't know, there was somebody else who had this coat that was way too big for them, and it was so humorous that it had to be drawn. And I'll never forget that. So those idiosyncrasies that kind of stay with you, because the visual absurdities are ripe for sketchbooking, if you know what I mean. I want to talk to, I think it's Ranju, and I appreciate your submission. It's quite beautiful, and I have to tell you that of all the media in the drawing realm, I have had the most trouble myself with oil pastel, because it is what we refer to as a non-drying oil-based material, and therefore it has a certain set of circumstances which prevent it from being handled in a way that oil paint can be handled. Oil paint likes to cure and then dry, and there are various ways to handle the oil layers in the curing stage, in the tacky stage, versus in the hard dry stage. And I have always felt very attracted, or I have an affinity for that kind of work, whereas oil pastel just gives me trouble. And so seeing an accomplished work like this and thinking about the edges that you put together in this image made me think of a person we've been talking about over at the Academy quite a bit the last year called Hilna Alf Klint, who I think now is being credited as the first truly abstract artist before all the guys came to town and claimed all the credit. And the reason why I think it would be kind of fun to look at is because there is a vestige of figure inside of this composition. And this is one of the more figure pieces that I selected of hers. And look at her dates, 1862 to 1944. We're talking well in front of the abstract expressionist and abstraction, the period of creativity that was inaugurated by Picasso, that sort of thing, well before that period. The artist here, I think, is giving some variations of edge, some different things in the way that this is manipulated that just made me want to link the two of you in a similar way that just a minute ago I was linking Leonardo da Vinci. And I would probably pursue some of that even further, because right now it looks like in terms of the edges that we're looking at in your piece, some of them could use a little more sharpening, a little more of what I would call a spatial variation, meaning the more crisp you get some of those parts, the more they're going to project toward us, presumably. And the softer and more transitional those edges become, the more they may fall away from us. And if it were me, I will be playing in that sandbox to try to see if I could make some of this fall back in space away from me. Sometimes it's, again, a counterintuitive thing where you want to make what somebody would think is the focal point fall away, and other parts that seem incidental to an image, you want to make those project. So you could also play with that. That's part of the reason why I say that the technical side of this, the technique, is just as profound as the ideas that are hoisted upon it. That's my response. A very beautiful image, a very honest image, and one that I think could use some reference to some of the greats, especially Hilma. Next up on the hit list is going to be the great Jim. Jim and I have an ongoing collaboration through mentorship, and Jim's doing some beautiful work. A lot of these, which are legitimately drawings out of your sketchbook, I can see, Jim, they have the look and the feel of compositional studies. And I think that really brings up an aspect of today's discussion, which is about the sketchbook, that maybe people don't appreciate it as much as they could or often should. And so that's all about just looking at creating compositions in your sketchbook and designs in your sketchbook. And I sometimes don't handle it that way myself. I will often go in and do situational drawings. But as soon as you frame out something, everybody, as soon as you put this together and make that particular kind of framework, you're going after an orchestration, a composition, a design. And that design is going to have a certain psychological appeal to you. It's going to show you by way of the ellipse where your eye level is going to sit versus where your eye level is positioned over here. This one's just a little different, isn't it? Where your eye is, you're a bit lower in that eye level because you're just about seeing that ellipse turn into a line. I'm more a fan of this one, and I think you are too, because I believe you turned this into a painting, didn't you, Jim?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, it was a good call. I really love the Mondrian type of breakdown of the space back here. I think that's quite beautiful. And I like the fact that you get this reversal in your composition where you get a fall of an arc or archway, and then you get the dip, the opposing line, we could say, through there. I also like that this is tighter because that's what you'd want to see in a focal point. You'd want to see something get a little more foreshortened because it's more arresting on the eye. And if this were tighter in linear terms, if that makes sense, this would pull the eye away from that. So I think it's an exquisite composition. To be slightly critical of it, you're just about on the center. So the vertical axis is going to be right about there. The vertical axis is going to be halfway from left to right. And we know that to be the most important axis in the composition because so much is counterbalanced off of that. And my own take is that maybe you could play around with repositioning this element perhaps to the right or to the left, and maybe you could play around correspondingly with this element to the right or to the left. And that would be my thinking. You could kind of take the following idea and run with it, and that is, what if you could maneuver in like a pseudo S-curve, one thing off to the right side, one other thing or element off to the left side. You might be able to get some tension in there that would be really quite appealing. It may be too classicized if you do it that way, but it could be really interesting because you've got these two forms, this double opening in through here, offset by a single over there, so it might be nice to make this bigger anyway. And then you've got a shadow which is stretching out in this direction, and that's why it might be nice to get things happening in this alternative disposition. That's what I would suggest. But I love it. I think your work in the sketchbook here is stunning. Let's continue and look at a couple others and then we'll call it a day. These are from Penny, and I noticed, Penny, that you sent me some pen and inks of drawings, and then they had these notes in them. Your drawing family. That's another thing about sketchbooking. You don't have to put the sketchbook away when you're with the family and just break it out in a certain context. It can go with you and accompany you anywhere and just be there at the ready because it's a launch point for further creative ventures, as many of us may or may not be aware. And this also got us into, or brings us into, the conversation point of pen and ink, or white chalk and charcoal, but mainly pen and ink, which is why I think this is well worthy of our attention and are quite beautiful because there is something about the honesty of the line. You're showing something to me and to everybody that probably isn't meant to be shown. It's not meant to be put on a wall. In some ways, it makes it more worthy because you're not sitting there drawing something that you would anticipate would be well received by a viewer or a collector. I think there's something to be said for that, and I hope you understand my point and my meaning, because you don't want to paint in a tentative way for an audience. It would be like a musician who's trying to make an album for an audience that they anticipate will expect a certain sound, and the producer says, forget that, just do what's in your heart. And I think that's what we're looking at here, is something and someone who's in your heart that you're drawing. So I commend you for it. I know there's a lot to get to because you've got light and shadow, but isn't it cool to see how this shrouds the face in a sense of mystery? Almost like a graphic novel in a way. We got some other pen and ink drawings which I am adding, and these are from Robert. Now these are cityscapes, and we've got some things going on like the panorama and the buildings. There's really some fine work in here. It almost looks like calligraphy, language that you're drawing in, but there's a certain appeal to it, and it's a very different look than when you're getting into these areas and the lines become a lot more curvilinear as they crisscross each other. I think this adds a lot to what you're doing, and it gives me a sense of maybe your shoulder beginning to work through on the sketchbook. And I would just do a lot more of these. I might actually, if I were you, try to combine this, what I read is a micron pen, and something that has a slightly thicker tip. Because if you want a thicker piece, a graphic element that is wider, sometimes micron or something with such a fine tip can be a little bit abrasive on your thinking because it's hard to build up. Depends on the kind of artist you are. If you're a Giacometti type of artist, then it's fine. But if you're not, if you're really looking for this to silhouette itself, you may want to have a couple of pens at the ready and see if you can go about your business in that regard. Okay, I got a submission here from Maria, and Maria was doing a drawing from a photograph, and I know this person because he's a football player. It's not my forte. I don't know that much about football, but I know this guy is very famous. And to me, what seemed to immediately be the case in terms of trying to understand the construction was the position of the person's face, which is going to be an issue that I want to help you deal with. And the second is to have a great reference. And it just, for whatever reason, what flashed in my mind was this incredible drawing from the Albertina that was done by Annibale Carracci. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that drawing, but the position of the figure in the Carracci drawing is just about the same as the one of Patrick Mahomes. And so what I decided to do, when I looked at this, I could see that this was kind of straight on. It was just about horizontal and nearly vertical in the positioning. And so I thought, let me just go in here and adjust the positions of your figures. I think that makes it a lot easier to see what's going on in your figure, because when you have the face of your model and you have the face of your reference that is not in what I would call an exotic angle, an exotic position, then you can get into some fundamental placement questions. Like you take these lines right here, which are now much like the Carracci, and you start to imagine yourself positioning a form in space, thinking about an edge of a construction, and where, rhetorically, where is that edge going to be placed? Where are you going to place and position the form in through there? And that would help you to see what's going on, because I believe that your drawing on the face, now that we've made him vertical, needs to have a little bit more rotation. I'll put that in an R. If you can get the rotation similar to what you see on Patrick Mahomes here, you get a little bit more cheekbone on that side, and because of the cheekbone and the position question, that is that he's rotated that way slightly, then you get the nose, which is going to build on top of that like an arrow, like a block, like some kind of a form in space. And I think you got the right shape. It's just that what it's sitting upon isn't giving you the reference that you're after. So you got to go after the greater head and the position of the greater head first. Once you get that, it's all midline, it's all center line, because then you take this center line, you pull it back, and you can get the placement of the nostril, and then this, and then that, and so on and so forth. So it's almost like a domino effect. He's playing games with the positions of the eyes. I always loved how these eyes look slightly out away from you. I don't know how he did that, but it's almost, in a way, sort of supernatural, the way that he's done it. And then you look at the mark making, speaking of the Karachi, right around here. This is exquisite. This getting heavy, this part gets light, then you get heavy again, then you get heavy again here, then you get light there. And so there's an alternating current running through the line and the mark making in that, which is it's just mind blowing. And I would encourage you to play with that in the drawing. It may be easier in a cast when you're ready, but you want to get some heaviness, some breathability, some more heaviness, again, some more heaviness. Use a master drawing as a reference, as an inspiration, as you play with the image, because otherwise you'll be looking too much at the photograph for approval in a certain way or for legitimacy. And I want you to use your creative initiative, the masterwork, and the photo together, please. Nolan sent me some pretty beautiful looking drawings of features, which I think are terrific because this is what you do. It's kind of like your go-to as you're thinking about how you engage with drawing, how you think about the form, and what occupies your fascination when you're on your downtime or something like that. It's really a marvelous thing to keep this going because you're brainstorming the forms, you're thinking about the different ways you could depict these structures. And so you know where I'm going to go with this, Nolan. I'm going to bring in John H. Vanderpool, some of the plates of which I saw and photographed at the Vanderpool Archive and Museum in Chicago. And some of these things are really amazing because what they're doing is they're building on a history of feature drawing, which goes way back to earlier treatises from centuries past. They would use features as stepping stones to portrait work to get people ready to go for studying the full figure eventually, getting into multi-figure compositions. And I would merely submit to you that some of this imagery is quite poignant for what you're trying to do. I could see echoes in Vanderpool's disposition here of that egg shape, that piece we call alar cartilage, the construction of which is right above it, and how that could guide you. I think of this as slightly different than the egg you're making. It might be, in effect, like two eggs or two forms you're bringing together and you're attaching them right at the midline. In other words, one form here and one form there, and then right up against the edge, right there and here, you're getting the highlight. And I see this in Vanderpool. I see him doing that in these different sections, thanks to both the line work, but also in terms of the highlight. There's some parts here, as well as in the diagramming in here and in through there, that I feel you can really get more ingrained in the way that you organize the features, the way you think about the nose as a piece of geometry, because that's really what it is. It's this vital element that has a geometric underpinning, and it's different from every person to every other person according to a variety of factors. And I share that fascination, which is why I would go back and forth again, really take a good look at some of this stuff and see if you could draw in a way out of your memory, especially this and all those incredible triangles. You know how he does this, triangle number 1, triangle number 2, the ground plane that it's on, triangle number 3, this, and then triangle number 4. Okay, so it's a series of triangles that could be built up, not even to mention the front of the nose, that you could continue to look at as you organize in your sketchbook. In terms of your other form here, your eye, you've got various other things happening, and Vanderpool is exceedingly interested in reminding us that there is a curtain here falling down upon the eye, and that when the eye upfolds away from that curtain, there are pieces that get pushed and pulled into particular positions. And you're always thinking about that when you go to these eye cover folds, when you go to these infraorbital furrows, where you go to these lower eyelid furrows. Everything has a name to it, and it has a name because it is so clearly important. There's something about that eye cover fold, this one here, that keeps you guessing. I have to tell you, it is one of the most elusive forms in the human body. It's a form that I was drawing so much on this piece that's behind me in the dissection. And it's really a crazy form to look at because it's got a buoyancy to it. The eye cover fold and the eye lid is not simply a piece of skin. I have to tell you that. There's a lot more going on than simply it being a piece of skin. There's a gland in there, and when I say buoyant, it's got a form that you have to contend with. It almost has a life of its own. And I think that's why there are so many creative variances of it in our history, from people like Vanderpool to folks I go back to again and again, like Abbott Thayer. Abbott Thayer did some amazing eyes. I would take a good look at that. I hope that helps. Let's look at a couple more. I have Gilnar's drawing ready for you. Speaking of Nikolai Fechin and opportunities on the horizon, you did a beautiful drawing here in the Nikolai Fechin world. I know how tough this is because I drew the same drawing, and what I decided to do was to juxtapose your drawing with the one that I copied, which is in the next slide here, and that way we could have a conversation, because there are two things really that come to my mind over and above the necessities of getting the calligraphy of the line to work well. It's clearly working well. Your calligraphy is beautiful. Your line weight is going great, and you got to keep drawing because I fully support it and I believe in you. Where you're faltering in the drawing is in two categories. Number one is in the center of gravity thing. Remember the line of equilibrium that I did in the tutorial? Do you notice in the copy that I made that I actually drew a vertical over here? And the reason why I drew the vertical next to my drawing was so that I could gauge just how much fall back or recoil I'm getting versus just how much projection I'm getting. And I feel like you've got a pretty good idea of the projection. It's not quite as activated as it needs to be. It's got to go a little further out. And the associated oblique muscle right about here should follow suit. It should scoot just a little further to the right. But then once you get it out to a certain moment, somewhere around here, I think you're recoiling aggressively, and I think that's really hurting your piece in terms of getting that echo of the figure. You don't have to make it exactly like what you see, and yet there is something that I think has exceeded the mark, as we say, in terms of making it work. It's interesting because so much of figure work, even composition in general, is a matter of balance and counterbalance. As soon as you put in a mark of any sort, it's like having a note in a song. There's got to be an answering note or a section or a bridge or a chorus that gives you some counterweight. Because if you don't have counterweight in the piece, it's probably going to feel like your figure is losing balance or losing their grip on equilibrium, which is what I think you're getting. The second critical thing to bring up in your piece is something you already know, and that is proportion. As you draw your figure, you want to be imagining something that I heard a long time ago from a very famous art teacher. His name was Ted Seth Jacobs, and he was lecturing to a group of students, and he was really a fascinating guy. He passed a number of years ago, all sorts of great stories about him. But he said, imagine your figure gets up in the drawing and walks off the page. So imagine your figure is like an animated figure. And if your figure were to stand right now, I believe pretty firmly that your figure's legs would be insignificant in terms of their proportion. The other thing about making that push for proportional thinking is we should also remember the weight of the legs, the weight of the feet, the weight of the thighs, and how that is impacting the overall anchorage of her figure. Because this is sweeping back in space, and it's giving you that aforementioned counterbalance. And if you don't have the foot far enough over to the left, you won't have the counterweight, and she'll fall back even further. So it's an interesting thing, isn't it, to imagine parts of the drawing that can equip you as you think more broadly and strategically going forward. All right, let's see. The next drawing here, Benjamin sent in an image, and it also had some beautiful line work going. I think we talked about this in one of the tutorials, and that is we want to be extremely selective about the directionality that we're using. And it's nice to see that the directions here, which are more balanced in the horizontal category, I see some right-handed centric hatch mark going on, some right-handed hatch, and then I see a whole lot of vertical or longitudinal hatch going on. And I just really like that. I thought that was a beautiful feature in the piece, and I think that the heaviness of the line weight in through here is also a very appealing aspect of what you're drawing. And I think in terms of making it better, making it stronger, to push it a little further, honestly, because you're getting some warm graphite in the background, in the hair, and you're getting some cool graphite, some cooler passages in the shadows. And I'm just wondering about where that's going to go. How you can picture that arm and that hand as they compile down into the base of the drawing, and what you're going to do with this area that sits behind the figure, especially with regard to the open form. If you've been paying attention to the tutorials, you can remember that we were talking about open form and breathability in some of the passages of drawing versus closed form. And open form is going to give you literally an opening, like a passageway, as you draw in your structures, to give you a sense of traveling in through contours, whereas other parts of the drawing are closed, like doorways. And I'd like you to think a little bit about that as you go and pursue this further. If we have a reference image or some kind of a master artist to look to, I'm thinking about Kathy Kollwitz for some reason in your drawing, and how great she was at making these environments and these kinetic fields of hatchmark function beautifully. You might want to look at Kathy Kollwitz as you're playing with the image. Last but not least, we've got Josh here. And Josh sent in a beautiful pen and ink drawing that it looks like it's out of his sketchbook. It is remarkable over the course of all these sketches that we've seen today. We've seen some oil pastels. We've seen some things that are more micron based. We've seen some beautiful graphite drawings and even some graphite crayon combinations. And now we get what looks to me like a ballpoint pen. And I'm not sure if I'm right about that, but that's how I read it. You could let me know if I'm wrong, Josh. But the reason why I think it looks like a ballpoint is because ballpoint has a very particular way of working. And I don't think ballpoint gets enough credit, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot when you look at ballpoint pen drawing that is really worth studying a little bit further, because ballpoint is just an amazing structure. It has an amazing warmth to it as we look at the form, and there's breathability as well. One of the things about drawing in ballpoint, though, is it can compile on the paper. It can get to where the ballpoint will create these little like deposits of ink. And so if you're going to draw in ballpoint, you may be getting some of that here. It's oftentimes a good idea to have a napkin or a paper towel or something like that that you can wipe the pen on occasionally. That's the only thing. Otherwise, you just let it fly and continue to build it up, because it's a very subtle, soft hatch mark in the way that it works. You're drawing a guy who has got a beautiful beard, and all those directions make a ton of sense to me, the way that they're crisscrossing. They're very unpredictable, and that's another thing that we really love about great works in a sketchbook. As you brainstorm, which is the word I've used the last few minutes, you're going to be trying things that don't necessarily make a ton of sense. Like maybe this and this together don't feel like they're the right thing to do. Or maybe this is too much at a right angle to that marker. And perhaps it feels like it isn't the perfect kind of solution or something like that. So when you're trying these out, you want to pay attention to what's working. Because when you try to take in the entire image and you get all these directions here, it's like your eye can't totally focus on one single direction. And because of that, they work as an ensemble, folks. So remember that, because there's going to be times when you develop a dominant mark making scenario, something where you get marks that feel like they're playing out broadly and through here. And if that isn't working at all, you may want to pull from the strategy that you put to use down on the beard and see if you could shake things up in here and continue to break apart the hatch marks in different directions. What you're doing with the hair, to me, is a harbinger of things you could do in the skin more. A couple things also, this is getting a little concave. You might want to look at that. And I'm also reminded of what I said earlier about the drawing of the cityscape, where you might want to have something at the ready where you can broaden your line out and just give some of this a little bit more thickness if you need it. But all in all, just a beautiful drawing. Really stunning work in open form depiction. And there's an intensity to this guy that's really nice. You're going to want to look at your head structure though and really give yourself a little bit more of an exploration of the form, especially the planes back here on the left side where the masseter is concerned, and in particular some of the zygomatic stuff. I think you could really use some zygomatic studies in the way that that form becomes one of the hallmarks of great portraiture. The zygomatic is indispensable. Let's paint a picture for a second. Someone in your class or maybe your colleague, your neighbor is painting the figure or drawing the figure along with you. There's a tendency for the individual to let their eyes rest on the model. Okay? They rest on the model. That is, they look up at the model and that's their mainstay. That's like their default setting, is to stare at the figure. And it often becomes illuminating when I'm talking to somebody to advocate that they rest their eyes on their picture and they glance up at their model. So when you glance at the model, you scan the model, that means you see the shapes. When you're painting the model, to go back again to oil painting, if you're staring at your painting and not your model, as soon as you flash to the model, you see the impression of the color, and you don't go in and name the color because you're looking at the orchestration of the light on the form. This is a very important point. And so my way of answering your question, which is a great one, is to say, if you don't default to the mirror and you just let the mirror be an outside perspective on things, like an awakening tool, because it shocks your eye. That's what it does. It awakens your eye to the possibilities. Then it's going to be fine, because all it's giving you is an alternate point of view and taking you away from that psychological push that we all have to want to be accurate. It's a surprise when we see just how off it may appear. Usually that surprise happens the next day because we've had time to sleep on it, we've gone and done something else, we come back to it the next day and it's like, oh my God, what was I thinking? But at the time, you feel like it's going well, you're doing the best you can, but there is a vested psychological thing going on with your eye and the way you see. That's why I've always said you see with an eye that feels, because you're feeling your way through the weight, but you're also feeling your way through the psychology of the experience. And so you have to use the mirror regularly, but as a thing which is not pulled in too often. That's my contention. And the same with a black mirror. The idea of using a black mirror is to take a piece of glass, paint one side of the glass black, brown, green. Corot used a green mirror. And what you do is once you take that painted side, you back it with some kind of a piece of cardboard. And that way you look through the side that isn't painted. And that gives you a shape or a mask configuration of your subject matter. Okay, in reverse. It's always been called the black mirror because it's been a go-to atelier tool for generations. And same with that. Use it occasionally, intermittently, but not obsessively. Yes, the only thing about the phone, I've thought about all these things too, is it freaks the model out. And because it is a camera, and the models, they don't see a black mirror, they see a camera and they see privacy, and it creates a situation. I can say that. It's great to have this kind of awesome organic community that we're working on. I love the comments that you all offer through the tutorials, and everything that I get, I read and I try to respond to, because we're building something. And in a lot of ways, what's cool about this space is there's a lot of innovation in it, a kind of intellectual innovation. We're trying to figure out ways of learning specifics better, reawakening in some cases archival information and giving it new life. And that's what this feels a lot like to me. Okay, I appreciate you being here, and what I will do in the immediate future is put together some semblance of a recording here and share it with you as soon as I can. Please keep a lookout for the posting on advanced mentorship and the upcoming constructive course, and I look forward to seeing you either indirectly or directly in the very near future. Thank you again. Appreciate it. Okay. Have a great day. Thank you so much. See you later.